If you remember the 1990s, you probably remember the feeling. The Cold War was over, the Berlin Wall was history, and it really seemed like we were on a one-way track to a future of peace, cooperation, and progress. But then you look around at the world today, and that future feels like a lifetime away. And that's the big question, isn't it? What happened? How did we get from that incredible peak of optimism to the much more complicated, competitive world we're all living in right now? The answer, it turns out, has a lot to do with a really powerful idea that shaped that entire era, the unipolar illusion. So, what is the unipolar illusion? Well, it was this deep-seated belief that the really unique situation after the Cold War, with America as the single dominant superpower, wasn't just a temporary moment. People thought it was the finish line, the final chapter that history had been building towards all along. But as we're about to see, it was just a moment, not a final destination. Okay, so to really get our heads around this illusion, we've got to go back to what created it in the first place. Because the collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't just another news event. It was a seismic shift that completely rewired how the entire world worked. And it wasn't just about geopolitics, it was psychological. The source material says it changed the emotional climate of history. And that's so true. For almost half a century, the Soviet Union was the rival. It was the great other that forced a kind of discipline on the world. Its very existence was this constant reminder that the Western way of doing things was just one way, not the only way. And then, poof, it was gone. And this slide just lays it out so perfectly. You go from this disciplined, bipolar world, two big players keeping each other in check, to a world that was just completely lopsided, unipolar. With its main competitor off the board, the United States was the only superpower left standing. Its military, its economy, its whole political model, it all seemed totally unmatched, like it was the universal standard.
But here's the twist. That incredible, overwhelming victory led to an equally incredible misreading of the situation. It's where a temporary moment of advantage got mistaken for a permanent truth about where history was headed.
So here's how that logical leap happened. Step one was the observation, and it was dead on. The Soviet system totally and utterly failed. But step two was the inference, a much shakier idea, that because the Soviet system failed, the Western system must be the final, ultimate answer. And that leads you right to step three, the grand misreading, seeing this temporary setup as some kind of universal destiny for everyone.
And what happened was this victory made everything feel abstract. The actual concrete things holding the system up, like American military power and economic might, they started to fade into the background. Ideas like free markets and global cooperation started to seem like these natural, self-sustaining forces, like they would just run on their own forever, without anyone needing to power the machine.
And all of this brewed up this incredible atmosphere of confidence. It's honestly hard to imagine that feeling today, but for a while there, it really seemed like the future was clear, predictable, and just overwhelmingly positive. I mean, just look at these ideas. They were just in the air back then. The big one was that major wars between big countries were a thing of the past. The internet was going to connect us all. Global trade would make fighting too expensive. Nationalism was on its way out. And sooner or later, every country was just going to become a liberal democracy. This wasn't some fringe theory. This was mainstream thinking. And you can see why, right? When one country is that powerful and its way of doing things seems to be winning everywhere, it's just so easy to fall into that trap. It becomes incredibly difficult to separate a temporary moment of dominance from the final inevitable direction of the world. Okay, so if that optimistic vibe was the illusion, what was the reality? What were the hidden supports, the actual pillars holding that whole 90s world up? Well, let's pull back the curtain. These were the nuts and bolts. The whole system was resting on some very specific and very temporary conditions. You had the US Navy basically providing free security for global trade. You had Russia, which was way too weak and chaotic to challenge anyone. And you had China, whose incredible rise was seen as a good thing. The thinking was that as China got richer, it would naturally just become more like us. These weren't laws of history. This was just a particular, fragile arrangement of power. And this brings us to such a critical point. When a system is working really, really well, you stop seeing the things that are holding it up. Success makes you blind to the foundations. The order just feels natural, like it's running itself, and you completely forget about the specific and maybe fragile conditions that made the whole thing possible. And of all those hidden supports that started to wobble, One proved to be the game changer: China. It plugged into the global economy faster than anyone thought possible, but it didn't play by the expected rules. It got incredibly wealthy without becoming a democracy, and that one fact, more than anything else, started to pull the whole story of the 90s apart at the seams. So, how are we supposed to think about the 1990s today? Was it all just a fantasy? Was it a lie? Not at all. It just needs to be reframed. We need to see it not as the end of the story, but as something else entirely.
And this is the real key. The 90s weren't a lie. The optimism was real. The progress was real. But it was a rare and temporary window in history, an exception to the rule, made possible by a totally unique global power structure. It wasn't the new normal. It was more like a brief holiday from the tougher, more competitive realities of history, realities that are now very much back.
And that leaves us with a really crucial question for our own time. The great era of that era was mistaking a brief moment for a permanent endpoint. So it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What are the big, widely held beliefs we have today that might just be the product of our own temporary conditions? What illusions are we living inside of right now?